The laughing aliens. The grand arena of HFY was filled with the loud roars of alien spectators. It was a place of violence, pride, and power, where the strongest warriors from across the galaxy fought to prove their strength. Massive screens hovered in the air, displaying past battles where creatures with razor-sharp claws, molten skin, and bone-crushing limbs tore each other apart. In the middle of this chaos, one lone human sat in the stands. Captain Ray Carter leaned back in his seat, watching the arena below with a calm expression. He was dressed in a simple brown jacket and black combat boots, looking out of place among the heavily armored alien warriors. But it was not Carter that caught their attention. It was his pet. A small, fluffy creature sat beside him, resting its head on his lap. It looked like an ordinary dog from Earth. Black fur, sharp ears, and warm brown eyes. It wagged its tail happily, completely unaware of the monstrous aliens around it. A few aliens in the stands noticed the animal and burst into laughter. "Haha! What is that thing?" One of them bellowed, a four-armed brute with skin like stone. "The mighty human warrior carries a pet." Another sneered, his tentacle-like fingers twitching with amusement. Carter remained silent, gently scratching behind the creature's ear. The dog-like animal let out a content sigh, its eyes closing as if it had not a care in the world. More aliens noticed and started mocking him. "Are you afraid, human? Do you need a comfort animal? Maybe he thinks his pet will protect him. How pathetic." The laughter grew louder, echoing across the arena. Even the announcer, a tall reptilian creature with glowing blue eyes, chuckled as he addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the great tournament, we have a guest today, the human. And look, he has brought his fierce warrior companion." The crowd howled in amusement. Some aliens clapped, others threw small objects toward Carter, though nothing serious. Still, Carter did not react. He kept his hand on his pet's head, his fingers idly stroking its soft fur. The creature opened one eye, its gaze flickering toward the laughing aliens. But just as quickly, it closed again, remaining calm and relaxed. One of the alien warriors, a massive, muscular creature with sharp tusks, stepped forward. He was over 9 feet tall, covered in thick, grayish-green armor plating that grew naturally over his body. His clawed hands twitched with excitement, eager to fight. "You humans are weak," he growled, his deep voice vibrating through the arena. "That is why you keep pets instead of warriors." The crowd cheered in agreement. To their surprise, Carter finally spoke. "Careful," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want to upset him." There was a brief silence before the aliens exploded into laughter again. "Him?" The tusked warrior smirked, stepping closer. "You think this tiny animal is dangerous." He suddenly grabbed the creature by the scruff of its neck and lifted it into the air. The dog-like pet let out a soft whine, but did not struggle. The crowd roared. The warrior grinned, turning in a circle to show everyone the helpless animal in his hands. "Haha! Look at it! What a joke!" Carter did not move. His face remained neutral, his green eyes steady. The warrior laughed louder, then tossed the creature. Gasps filled the arena as the small animal flew through the air, spinning before it crashed onto the ground. The laughter stopped. The pet landed softly, rolling once before standing back on its feet. It shook itself, as if nothing had happened, then slowly turned its head toward the warrior. Its eyes glowed. A strange shiver ran through the crowd. It was subtle, but those close to the arena felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, as if a cold wind had swept through. The warrior stopped grinning. The creature took a slow step forward. The ground beneath its paws seemed to darken. Something felt wrong. A nervous chuckle came from the audience, but no one spoke. The warrior scowled, lifting his foot to stomp on the creature, but suddenly froze. His body went rigid. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open, lips trembling. His entire form started shaking violently, his claws scratching against his own chest. "What?" "What is this?" he gasped. The other warriors stared in confusion. Then the warrior let out a terrible scream. It was a sound of pure terror, not pain. His eyes were wide with horror, staring at something that was not there. He clawed at the air, his breathing turning into choked gasps. The other aliens backed away. "Tell you what's happening to him," one muttered. "Is he sick?" Another asked, but their voices were no longer mocking. The warrior fell to his knees, shaking uncontrollably, his eyes never blinking. It was as if he was seeing something unbearable, something worse than death. The creature, the small pet they had laughed at, watched him silently. It blinked once, its glowing eyes fading back to normal. Then, as if nothing had happened, it walked back to Carter's side and sat down. Carter calmly reached out and patted its head. The crowd was silent. The laughter had vanished. For the first time, the aliens felt something strange, something they had never expected from a mere pet. Fear, the first sign of fear. A dead silence filled the great arena of HFY. The same warriors who had been roaring with laughter just moments ago now stood frozen, their gazes locked on the massive, armored alien warrior who had collapsed on his knees. His body shook uncontrollably, his 4 clawed fingers gripping at the air, as if trying to fight off something that no one else could see. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes wide with horror. The alien who had once mocked the human's pet now seemed like a broken creature. His comrades hesitated, unsure of what had happened. "Gorgeth?" a reptilian warrior asked, stepping forward. "What's wrong?" Gorgeth did not answer. He stared into empty space, his breathing shallow and uneven. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Captain Ray Carter sat completely still, his hand resting on the small, fluffy creature beside him. His pet, Max, looked the same as before, small, unthreatening, even innocent. But the aliens no longer saw him that way. The atmosphere in the arena had changed. It was cold. Not in temperature, but in feeling, as if an unseen presence had stolen the warmth from the air. Some warriors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Even the announcer, usually full of energy, hesitated before speaking. Aha, a minor accident, perhaps." The reptilian alien's voice cracked slightly, trying to lighten the mood. "It seems our mighty warrior, Gorgeth, is feeling." Before he could finish, Gorgeth let out another chilling scream. His claws tore at his own armor, scratching deep gouges into the thick plating as though he were trying to rip it off. His tusks clattered together as he shook violently, his muscles spasming under his greenish armor plates. The laughter from earlier was completely gone. The crowd watched in horror. "What is happening to him?" a voice from the stands whispered. Another alien, a hulking beast with 4 glowing red eyes, took a cautious step forward. "Gorgeth, stop this madness." The moment he touched Gorgeth's shoulder, he jerked backward violently, as if he had been electrocuted. His red eyes dilated, and he stumbled away, gasping for breath. "And no, impossible. I saw." He did not finish his sentence. Instead, he turned and ran. A warrior of HFY, one of the strongest fighters in the galaxy, fled in front of the entire arena without looking back. Fear spread through the audience like wildfire. This was not a physical attack. It was something else, something worse, something that crawled into the mind and dug deep, deeper than any blade ever could. Carter watched silently, his green eyes steady. Max, the small, harmless-looking creature, yawned and stretched before curling up beside his feet, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Human," a voice growled. Carter turned his head slightly. One of the larger warriors, a 6-eyed brute with armored plating like steel, had stepped forward. His stance was no longer mocking. It was cautious. "What did your pet do?" the alien demanded. His deep voice, once confident, now carried an edge of hesitation. Carter raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" he asked innocently, scratching behind Max's ear. "He didn't do anything." The six-eyed brute snarled, but his posture was tense. "Don't play games, human. Gorgeth is one of the strongest warriors in the sector. He fears nothing." Carter's hand paused for a moment before he shrugged. "Maybe," he said simply. "Or maybe he's just finally seeing something worth being afraid of." The brute stiffened. More murmurs ran through the arena. Warriors shifted uncomfortably. Some clenched their weapons, others stepped back without realizing it. The laughter from earlier felt like a distant memory now. Something had changed, and they all knew it. "Impossible," another alien whispered. "It's just an animal." But none of them believed that anymore. Max lifted his head, his warm brown eyes blinking up at Carter. He looked at his owner for a moment, then turned his gaze toward the gathered warriors. For the briefest moment, his pupils glowed faintly, a deep, unnatural gold. And then, the lights in the arena flickered. The shadows in the room grew darker, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The air grew heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. Another warrior gasped, stepping backward. His breathing grew ragged, his fingers twitching as he looked around frantically. "And no," he whispered. "I see them. They're here." A different alien, one of the tournament guards, turned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" The warrior's face turned pale. The things in the dark," he gasped. "What things?" The warrior screamed and collapsed onto the floor, shaking. More whispers filled the crowd. More aliens began to panic. Some warriors drew their weapons. Others started looking at Carter, their gazes filled with suspicion and fear. And yet, through it all, Max just sat there, wagging his tail. Carter sighed, patting his pet's head. "I told you not to scare them too much," he murmured. Max let out a soft huff, as if disappointed. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the unnatural feeling in the air disappeared. The lights stopped flickering. The arena returned to normal. The terrifying presence was gone, but the damage was done. The aliens no longer laughed at the human's pet. Now, they feared it. And for the first time in history, the warriors of HFY 7 wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The nightmare begins. The air inside the arena was different now. It was not the same place filled with loud laughter and booming cheers. Instead, a heavy silence had settled over the warriors, the audience, and even the announcer. No one could explain what had just happened, but they all felt it. The fear. A warrior like Gorgath should not have fallen to his knees like a child. A soldier of his rank, who had once torn through an entire enemy fleet single-handedly, should not have been reduced to a trembling mess in front of the galaxy's best fighters. And yet, there he was, still shaking, his wide, empty eyes staring into something invisible. Something only he could see. Carter, sitting calmly in his seat, gave his small, fluffy pet another pat on the head. Max looked up at him, his warm brown eyes blinking with innocent curiosity. But the warriors of the arena no longer saw a harmless animal. They saw something else, something unnatural, something monstrous. The announcer finally broke the silence, though his voice wavered. We appear to have a situation with one of our fighters," he stammered, his glowing blue eyes darting between Gorgath and Carter. But nobody was paying attention to him anymore. Instead, all eyes were fixed on Carter, and the creature sitting beside him. A sudden thump echoed through the arena. Another warrior had collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. His breathing was erratic, his fingers clawing at the sides of his skull. His eyes were shut tight, his face twisted in pain. Then he let out a horrified scream. It was not a cry of battle, nor a scream of injury. It was a sound of someone witnessing something they were never meant to see. The audience flinched. Warriors who had once stood proudly now took cautious steps away from Carter and his pet. The shadows around the arena seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, creeping closer to the warriors who had mocked Carter earlier. Some of them began to panic. What's happening? One of the six-eyed aliens hissed, his voice trembling. What is this madness? Another fighter, a three-armed reptilian, clenched his fists and growled. Enough of this. It's a trick. He pulled out a plasma dagger, its blade humming with blue energy. The moment he took a step forward, Max moved. Not like a normal animal. Not like a predator. It was something else entirely. 1 second, the small furry creature was sitting next to Carter. The next second, it was gone. No sound, no motion, just gone. And then, it reappeared behind the warrior. A blur of shadows and shifting light, Max materialized out of nowhere, standing right behind the reptilian fighter. The alien warrior froze. His eyes widened in shock. He could feel something behind him. Something cold, something wrong. He turned slowly, his hands gripping his weapon. Max tilted his head, looking up at him. And then, his eyes changed. The warm brown turned into a deep, glowing gold. The warrior's entire body locked up. His plasma dagger clattered to the ground. And then he began to shake. No, he choked out, his voice a whisper. No, no, no. Whatever he saw, whatever was happening inside his mind, it was too much. His breath quickened, his muscles stiffened, and his tail wrapped around himself in pure terror. The arena watched in frozen silence as one of the galaxy's strongest warriors fell to his knees, gasping for air. He began sobbing. Tears streamed down his scaly face, his hands trembling so violently that he couldn't even lift them. I see them, he whispered, his pupils shrinking. His voice sounded broken. They're here, he continued, his words barely audible. They're watching me. They're waiting. Nobody knew what he was talking about. But the way he looked at Max, like the creature was the embodiment of every nightmare he had ever known, was enough to make the entire audience step back in fear. Max wagged his tail once, then calmly trotted back to Carter. Carter exhaled slowly, then looked around at the terrified aliens in the arena. You laughed. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the entire stadium. All of you. You thought I was a joke. You mocked my pet. He gently scratched behind Max's ears, and the creature purred softly in response. But let me tell you something, Carter continued, his green eyes flashing. This pet of mine. He glanced back at the shaking, broken warriors who had once mocked him. He's seen things your kind could never understand. The announcer swallowed hard, his reptilian skin pale. One of the warriors bolted for the exit, stumbling over himself in his rush to escape. The rest of the audience, they didn't move. They didn't speak. They barely even breathed. Because for the first time, in the history of the great arena of HFY 7, the warriors of the galaxy learned the meaning of true fear, and it had come from a human's pet. The arena turns to chaos. The great arena of HFY 7, once a place of laughter, brutality, and spectacle, had fallen into unnatural silence. Moments ago, the aliens mocked the human for bringing a pet into a battlefield. Now those same warriors stood frozen, watching in horror as two of their own lay shaking and broken on the arena floor. The once mighty Gorgath, who had never lost a battle, was still curled up, eyes wide, mouth trembling, whispering things that made no sense. The reptilian warrior, who had challenged Carter moments ago, was weeping like a child, mumbling about unseen things watching him. The rest of the warriors, some of the strongest in the galaxy, were afraid to move. Carter sat calmly, his expression unreadable. He gave a small pat on Max's head. His pet, no, his weapon, looked up at him, tail wagging, tongue flicking out like an innocent creature that had done nothing wrong. But the aliens knew better now. The announcer, the one responsible for keeping the crowd entertained, finally tried to salvage the situation. His voice, once booming and full of confidence, now sounded unsteady. F fighters, remain in your positions. He called out, though his voice cracked slightly. We will pause for a moment. Let the tournament doctors tend to." A scream cut him off. It came from one of the elite warriors in the stands, a four-armed brute with black armor-like skin and glowing orange eyes. He had been one of the loudest in mocking Carter earlier. But now, he stumbled backward, his hands clutching at his chest, his eyes wide with panic. "Get them, off me," he howled. "I can't them under my skin." The crowd gasped. There was nothing on him, but he saw something. He ripped his own armor apart, clawing at his own body, shrieking like he was being eaten alive. His eyes darted wildly, his breath ragged. The warriors near him stepped away in fear. Another thud echoed. Another alien fell to his knees, this time a massive cybernetic warlord, whose body was more machine than flesh. "No, not you. Stay basic," he bellowed, his metal-plated hands shaking violently. His entire body trembled as he reached for the plasma cannon attached to his arm, and aimed it at nothing, or rather, at something only he could see. Before anyone could stop him, he fired. A blinding explosion burst through the stands as the plasma shot hit solid rock, tearing apart part of the arena wall. The shockwave sent warriors flying, and the panic exploded into chaos. Some warriors tried to run, pushing past each other in their rush to get away from whatever was happening. Others drew weapons, eyes darting around wildly, seeing phantoms that weren't there. The once proud warriors of the Zyphor tournament had been reduced to screaming, desperate creatures, trying to escape a nightmare that no one else could see. All because of one small creature sitting calmly next to a human. Carter exhaled, watching the chaos unfold. Max yawned. He looked bored. Then, without warning, he stood up, and the arena froze. Not physically, but every warrior, every spectator, felt it. That feeling. That unnatural, suffocating pressure. It was not rage. It was not violence. It was something far worse. Pure, mind-breaking dread. Max took one slow step forward. One of the warriors screamed and ran. Another dropped his sword, his fingers too stiff with fear to hold it. A massive 12-foot-tall war beast, who had never known fear in his life, let out a low whimper and took a slow step backward. Max took another step. The arena panicked. Some warriors ran for the exits. Others dropped to their knees, their minds breaking, whispering things about shadows, whispers, crawling things in the dark. A few were brave, or stupid, enough to try and fight. The cybernetic warlord, the one who had just fired his plasma cannon, roared and pointed his weapon at Max. "You will not make a fool of me," he bellowed. "I will end this now." He fired. A burning shockwave of plasma energy blasted toward Max. For the first time, Max moved, but not like an animal, not like a predator. He vanished. The plasma bolt hit empty air, exploding against the far side of the arena. And then, Max reappeared, directly in front of the warlord. Too close, too fast. The warlord barely had time to gasp before Max lifted his head and looked into his eyes. The warrior stopped breathing. His body froze. His mechanical limbs locked up, and his mouth fell open in pure, unfiltered horror. Then, he fell backward, landing with a heavy thud, staring at nothing. His mind was gone. The legendary cybernetic warlord had been defeated without a single drop of blood. And Max simply wagged his tail, looking up at Carter like a loyal pet waiting for approval. Carter sighed, scratching behind his ears. "I told you to take it easy," he muttered. Max huffed. By now, the arena was in complete chaos. Warriors had fled. Some had collapsed. Others still trembled, too scared to move. The announcer had long since abandoned his post. No one had ever seen anything like this. Not in the thousands of years this tournament had existed. And Carter stood up slowly, stretching his arms. He turned toward the few warriors who had not fled, the ones who still had enough willpower to stand. He gave them a small, knowing smile. "You all thought humans were weak," he said, his voice casual. "Thought we were soft. Thought we weren't dangerous." His green eyes glowed faintly. "But tell me something." He gestured at the ruined arena. The warriors, too broken to move, the ones who had fled in terror, and the ones who had completely lost their minds. "Do we look weak to you now?" Silence. No one spoke, because no one dared. Max trotted beside Carter as he walked toward the exit, stepping over the once proud warriors who had laughed at him minutes ago. This wasn't a battle. It was a lesson in fear. And the galaxy would never forget it. No more laughing. The once mighty arena of HFY, where the strongest warriors of the galaxy clashed in glorious battle, now lay in ruins of fear and madness. The laughter was gone. The jeering, the mocking, the confident boasts, all of it had been replaced with screams, trembling whispers, and desperate footsteps fleeing into the dark tunnels leading out of the Colosseum. The few warriors who still stood had no weapons drawn, not because they didn't want to fight, because they couldn't. They had seen what happened to those who challenged the human's pet. Their comrades, who had once been fearless champions, now lay on the ground, some whispering things no one could understand, some shaking violently, and others just sat there, unmoving, silent, staring into nothing. Their minds were gone. The last of the brave. A handful of warriors, the best of the best, still clung to their pride. Among them stood General Vorkal, a towering beast of a warrior, covered in thick, spiked armor made of living metal. His 3 yellow eyes burned with defiance, even as his claws twitched involuntarily. Next to him, a 6-limbed insectoid champion, known as Kavrax the Blade Wind, gripped the hilt of his twin plasma sabers, though his mandibles clicked nervously. These were legends, warriors who had survived galactic wars, fought against cosmic horrors, and stood victorious against armies that would have crushed entire planets. And yet, as they watched one small Earth creature calmly sit beside its human companion, they felt something they had never known before, a feeling more suffocating than battle, more unbearable than defeat, pure, primal, fear, the general's last stand. General Vorkal took a deep breath, forcing himself to step forward. His heavy armored boots echoed against the blood-stained stone floor. Carter didn't even turn his head. The general's deep, growling voice cut through the tense silence. "This," he paused, his throat dry, "this is an abomination." Carter finally glanced at him. "What is?" The general narrowed his eyes. "This thing," Vorkal snarled, pointing at Max. "It is not an animal. It is not a pet. It is a curse given form." Max let out a soft huff, wagging his tail. Vorkal clenched his fists. "What is it? What have you brought into this place?" Carter slowly stood up. For the first time, he actually looked serious. "I could tell you," he said calmly, "but it wouldn't matter. You wouldn't understand." Kavrax, the insectoid warrior, gritted his mandibles. "We have faced horrors beyond the stars, human," he hissed. "We have fought against the shadows of the abyss. We have stood against creatures that could shatter moons." Carter tilted his head. "And yet, you're afraid." The warriors flinched. They hated that he was right. Carter knelt beside Max, scratching his ears. "I wasn't lying earlier," he said. "Max really is my pet." He looked at the broken warriors, the ones who had been reduced to empty shells just from looking into Max's eyes. "But he's also something else." He stood up again, hands in his pockets. "You see, humans, we love our pets. We care for them. We raise them. We train them." His gaze sharpened. "And sometimes, when we need them, we unleash them." A shiver ran through the remaining warriors. Max stood up as well. The shadows around him shifted. His fur seemed to move on its own, rippling like liquid darkness. His warm brown eyes flickered, just for a moment, turning into that haunting, unnatural gold. Kavrax instinctively stepped backward. Vorkel gritted his teeth. "I refuse to bow to this madness." The general spat. He turned to his warriors. "If we run today, we will never stop running." He pulled a massive war blade from his back, the edges crackling with cosmic energy. "We fight." The remaining warriors roared in defiance, gripping their weapons. Their terror was still there, but so was their pride. They would not go down without a battle. A battle no one could win. Carter sighed, shaking his head. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than that." Max's ears twitched. And then, the world shattered. Not literally. But to the warriors, it might as well have. The air turned to ice. The ground beneath them darkened. And suddenly, the arena was gone. They were somewhere else. Somewhere impossible. One of the warriors, a heavily armored brute, turned his head, only to find his own corpse standing behind him. His own body, twisted, shattered, screaming in silent agony. Another warrior looked down at his hands and saw them melt away into liquid shadow. He opened his mouth to scream, only for thousands of teeth to pour out instead of sound. Kavrak staggered backward, his twin sabers flickering uselessly. He watched as the sky ripped open, revealing thousands of eyes, each staring directly into his soul. His limbs shook, his mind fractured. And then, everything returned to normal. The arena was back. The warriors stood frozen, their weapons clattered to the ground. And then, one by one, they collapsed. Not dead, but broken. Their minds shattered by something they could never describe. Something beyond reality itself. Carter stretched his arms. "I warned you," he muttered. He looked down at Max. "Are you done?" Max let out a soft woof, then trotted back to his owner's side, curling up at his feet. Carter looked around the arena, at the once mighty warriors, now lying defeated, trembling, and empty. And for the first time in HFY-7's history, the tournament was over. Not because someone had won, but because no one was left to fight. Carter glanced up at the terrified spectators. "I think we're done here," he said casually. "Come on, Max." As he turned to leave, he gave one final warning. "If any of you ever think about coming to Earth." He glanced at Max, then back at the silent, horrified aliens. "Just remember what happened here today." Max let out another small bark. And then, the human and his pet walked out of the arena. Behind them, the strongest warriors in the galaxy lay in silence, their laughter long forgotten. Because now, when they thought of Earth, they would think of Max, and they would never laugh again. The truth about Max. The great arena of HFY-7 was now silent, but not in the way of an empty battlefield. It was the silence of shattered minds, of warriors who had once stood unbreakable, now reduced to hollow shells of themselves. The laughter, gone. The pride, crushed. The so-called strongest fighters in the galaxy, defeated without a single drop of blood being spilled, and all because of a human's pet. Carter walked slowly toward the exit, Max trotting happily at his side, his tail wagging as if he had simply finished a morning walk. But before they could leave, a single voice stopped them. "Wait." Carter paused. He turned back. Among the wreckage of shattered minds and trembling warriors, one still stood. General Vorkel. His body was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. He stood tall, but his breath was uneven, his eyes flickering with something beyond fear. Not just terror, disbelief. Max looked at him, tilting his head slightly. Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You still want to fight, big guy?" Vorkel shook his head. "No, there's no point." He glanced at the fallen warriors, those who had been broken by something they couldn't understand. Then he turned back to Carter, his eyes burning with one final question. "What is that thing?" Carter stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. You really want to know? Vorkel nodded, his body tense. The remaining spectators, those who hadn't fled in terror, leaned in. They needed to know. What was Max? Why had one small, fluffy creature reduced the strongest warriors in the universe to nothing? Carter looked down at Max. The creature yawned, licking his nose. Then Carter chuckled. All right, you asked for it. A weapon unlike any other. Carter took a step forward. The entire arena flinched. Even Vorkel stiffened, though he tried to hide it. You aliens think humans are weak, Carter said. You look at us and see a species that's fragile, emotional, and soft. He gave a small smirk. And yeah, maybe we are, but we're also smart. We don't always win by being the strongest. We win by being the most dangerous. His hand rested on Max's head. And Max here, Carter continued. He's our proof. The crowd listened in silence. He was made for warfare, Carter said simply. A government project, built with a very specific purpose in mind. Something more powerful than plasma weapons, stronger than warships, deadlier than any superweapon you've ever seen. He looked at Vorkel directly. Psychological warfare. The general's eyes widened slightly. You see, it's one thing to kill your enemies. It's another to break them. Carter's voice dropped lower, his tone turning cold. Max doesn't kill. He doesn't rip people apart. He doesn't need to. He gestured at the fallen warriors. You saw what he does, didn't you? Vorkel swallowed hard. He shows them things, Carter said, not just illusions. Their worst fears, their deepest nightmares. The kind of fear that doesn't just make you scream, it makes you never sleep again. Silence. Absolute silence. He was trained to infiltrate enemy bases, walk in unnoticed, like any other animal. And then, Carter snapped his fingers. Entire armies fall apart overnight. He smirked slightly. No war, no resistance, just terror. Vorkel's breathing grew uneven. This is impossible, he whispered. Carter tilted his head. Is it? The general gritted his teeth. If this is true, then why is he with you? Why isn't he locked away in a military base, being used as a weapon? Carter grinned. Because I stole him. The crowd gasped. Even Max blinked up at Carter, as if surprised by the answer himself. The escape from Earth. Carter continued, his tone casual. You see, Earth's leaders, they're not stupid. They knew what they had created, and they were terrified of him. Because a creature that can destroy minds doesn't have enemies. He gave a dark chuckle. It has no leash. Vorkel froze. So what did they do? Carter continued. They tried to get rid of him, wanted to erase him, shut him down before he became something they couldn't control. He smirked, but they made a mistake. What mistake? Vorkel asked, almost afraid of the answer. Carter scratched behind Max's ear again. They let him grow attached to me. Max wagged his tail. And that's when it hit them. Max wasn't just a weapon. He wasn't just an experiment. He was loyal. Carter had bonded with the most dangerous creature ever created. And in return, Max had chosen Carter. I got him out before they could terminate him, Carter said simply. Took a ship, ran as far as I could. And now? He glanced around at the shaking warriors. Now we just travel. Meet new people. See new places. Make new friends. His smirk widened. And sometimes we remind the galaxy that humans, we aren't as weak as we look. The galaxy's new fear. Vorkel stared at him. For the first time, he realized Carter wasn't just a man with a pet. He was a man with the single most terrifying force in existence, walking at his side like a loyal dog. And that force had no leash. No one could control it. No one could stop it. Max let out a small woof, tail still wagging. And Vorkel, the mighty general, felt something he had never thought possible. A deep, inescapable terror. Leave this place, he whispered. Carter nodded. already planned on it. He turned, walking toward the exit, Max trotting beside him. As they disappeared into the dark corridors, the fear remained. Even long after they were gone, no one in the arena spoke. Because now, the warriors of HFY 7 had a new fear. Not of a weapon, not of a fleet, not of a superpower, but of a man and his pet. And they knew, without a doubt, the galaxy would never be the same. The new fear, the galaxy had changed that day. The greatest arena of HFY 7, once a monument to strength and bloodshed, was now nothing more than a graveyard of broken minds and shattered pride. The warriors who had once mocked the human and his pet had learned a lesson they would never forget. No one spoke. No one moved. And even those who hadn't fallen to madness refused to breathe too loudly, afraid that somehow, some way, that creature would hear them and return. Rumors began to spread. By the time Carter and Max had left HFY 7, the whispers had already begun. They traveled faster than light, spreading through merchant ships, secret communication networks, and the deep space outposts of bounty hunters and warlords. The story changed with every telling, growing more terrifying with each retelling. A human entered the tournament of HFY 7 with a monster disguised as a pet. He did not raise a single weapon, and yet the greatest warriors of the galaxy fell before him. They did not die in battle. They were broken, mind and soul. And none of them have ever recovered. Many refused to believe it. How could they? How could a small furry creature, a pet, reduce entire armies to nothing? And yet the evidence was clear. HFY 7 had shut down the tournament indefinitely. Some of the strongest warriors in the sector had gone missing, hiding in the darkest corners of the galaxy, unwilling to show their faces ever again. Others had been found staring at walls, whispering to themselves, trapped in nightmares they could never escape. No one knew exactly what had happened inside that arena, but they knew one thing for certain. The galaxy now feared two words: the human's pet, hunted by the unseen. In the weeks that followed, Carter and Max continued their travels across the stars. But things were different now. Before, they had been nothing more than drifters, hopping from one station to the next, exploring and keeping a low profile. Now, they were something else. They could feel it. The way people whispered when they entered a bar, the way eyes turned away when they passed through spaceports. There were no direct threats. No bounty hunters bold enough to make a move. But Carter knew. He could feel it in the air. The fear. The uncertainty. Some feared him. Some wanted to understand him. And some wanted to erase him. The Council's decision. Far across the galaxy, hidden within the floating citadel of Vortex Prime, the leaders of the most powerful factions in the known universe had gathered. The Galactic Dominion. The Syndicate of Shadows. The Auxiliary Hive Lords. The Titan-born clans. They had stood divided for centuries. But for the first time in history, they agreed on one thing. The human and his pet were too dangerous to exist. The Council's leader, a pale, blue-skinned being with 4 eyes and a mind that had calculated 1,000 futures, spoke into the void. A force that cannot be controlled is a threat to all. If one man can bring entire armies to their knees without lifting a single weapon, then what happens when others follow? The decision was made. A silent order was sent to the highest-ranking assassins, the deadliest bounty hunters, and the most ruthless minds the galaxy had to offer. Find the human and his pet, and eliminate them. The first attempt. Carter knew they were coming. He could feel it. The way space felt colder, the way stations grew quieter when he passed through them. Max knew too. He could smell it in the air, sense the way the stars seemed to shift uneasily around them. And then one night, they came. Carter was sitting at a small, dimly lit space cantina, sipping a drink that smelled vaguely of engine fuel and bad decisions. Max lay at his feet, tail twitching, his ears perked slightly. Then, The door opened. The room fell silent. 5 figures entered. They were not ordinary hunters. They were void walkers, trained assassins of the highest caliber, known for eliminating entire royal bloodlines without leaving a single trace. They did not speak. They did not need to. They moved toward Carter like shadows, silent and efficient. A normal man wouldn't have even noticed. But Carter, he just sighed. "Really?" he muttered. "This is how we're doing this." One of the assassins reached for their weapon. And then, Max opened his eyes. A mistake they would never forget. It happened faster than anyone could react. The assassins froze in place. Not physically, but mentally. They were trapped, caught in something they couldn't understand, something that dragged them into a nightmare before they even had time to scream. The entire cantina watched in horror as the assassins, some of the deadliest killers in the galaxy, began to shake, whisper, and claw at their own eyes. One let out a choked gasp, his body twitching violently before he collapsed. Another mumbled to herself, whispering things no one could understand. The last simply stood there, staring at Max. His mouth opened, but no words came out. And then he fell forward, silent. Dead? No. Something worse. His mind was gone. The cantina stared. Carter sighed, finishing his drink. He dropped a few credits on the table before standing up. He glanced at the bartender, whose hands were shaking as he cleaned a glass. "Sorry about the mess," Carter said casually. Then he turned to Max. "Come on, bud. Let's go." Max wagged his tail. The moment they stepped out of the cantina, the whispers started again. The human and his pet. They can't be killed. Not by weapons, not by armies, not even by the best assassins in the galaxy. And then the final whisper. If you see them coming, it's already too late. The nightmare continues. As Carter and Max disappeared into the vastness of space, the hunters came again. And again. And again. Each time, they fell. Not by gunfire. Not by blades. But by something much worse. By Max. By a nightmare that had no end. By a creature the galaxy would come to fear more than any war, any weapon, or any fleet. The human and his pet had become legends. Not heroes. Not villains. Something far worse. And in the farthest reaches of space, where no light touched the void, something watched. Something waited. Because the nightmare was only beginning.